guess which one. But I'll tell you what, if you're trying to organize a system and you've got points of departure from 64 different locations, it gets a little tough to try to figure it out. So when we think about the work, we got to think about how we can make it easier to be in contact with the men and women prior to release, so that we can do the real work. It's the toughest and most important work, is to work with every person who comes out and to meet the vision of the LA-PRI, the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Initiative, which is that every person released from prison has the tools and resources they need to succeed. Every person. Now, we don't treat everybody the same in the work because we follow evidence-based practices. That is, research practices that tell us what researchers, academics, scientists have developed that's proven to work to not just reduce individual criminality, one person at a time, but how you create whole systems to do that work so that we can raise the success rate across the board. But you all know very clearly in the work you do that if you want to raise the recidivism rate of 300, 400 people getting out of prison every month, you can only do that one person at a time. And so there's this interaction between the evidence and the research about what we do with individuals and what we do to improve systems. And those are the two moving parts of the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Initiative, called system change, driven by improved individual case planning. Make sense? So instead of spending 20 minutes introducing each other, when we get to questions, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. And if at the end of the day there's anybody who hasn't asked a question, we'll ask you to introduce yourself at the end and explain why you didn't have any questions. But hopefully we'll meet each other that way. And I may pick a couple of people out and introduce them throughout the day. One of the reasons that this session today, this is probably the 6th training session I've done in the state about in this parish, I should say, about LA-PRI. This one's different because we're at the beginning point through some fabulous support of the Angelina and Huey Wilson Foundation to have a new set of partners that are very deliberate in the work they're going to be doing around reentry. And with that new partnership that is emerging, we've got a couple of things going on that are very important I want to mention before we start. One is that in order to do this work well, it's got to be completely owned by the people in the state. And one of my goals is to work myself out of a job. We've got 2 years until I retire. And in that 2 years, everything that I've helped develop and work with and all this documentation that we have has to not only be owned by people like you, but you have to be well enough acquainted with it and part of it and owning it to be able to do these types of presentations. And for those of you that have sat through more than one of these, I think Verna, this is probably your 5th one. Mm-hmm. So for Verna, this is a train the trainer opportunity. Okay. Right? Yes. At some point I say, Verna, can you just do that for me? She's like, yeah. I've seen that. Give me the PowerPoint. We're good. But that's true with several folks. Todd Hamilton, certainly. Others who are here. So we have coalitions formed that have been very active in the community, very powerful, I think, in their dedication to the reentry capital area ReEntry coalition is formed, very active, and I've trained with them. They have adopted the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Initiative model. They have a steering team. There's a need in this community to broaden the number of stakeholders that are at the table. And as a result of some work that Wilson is funding, we have a team from Metamorphosis, Sharita and Pam. I think Reverend Jetson. This is Reverend Jetson. Let me shake your hand, sir. I've never met you. Talk on the phone several times. Thank you so much. Metamorphosis is going to be using their great experience in capacity building to help make certain that the entire community is represented as we're making these decisions together, as you're making the decisions together. I don't make any decisions. All I do is produce forums and facilitate discussions. I have absolutely no operational responsibilities whatsoever, I'm fond of saying. So Metamorphosis is going to be here, and they've got such great experience in capacity building. We have Social Works Institute, Bonnie Hawkins, who has received funding from Wilson to start the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Steering Team Association. If you know anything about what the LA-PRI has been doing for the past 3 years that we've been active in the state, you know that we're starting the work in 5 parishes that represent 40% of everybody who's in prison. Caddo, East Baton Rouge, Orleans, Jefferson, and St. Tammany. Those 5 parishes are first in line. And as I go through some of the materials today, we'll talk about what their local organizational structures look like. But those 5 parishes are very key to the effort. This association will provide opportunities for training, networking, interaction. And the local structure has both a large stakeholder base called a coalition, but then some number of them, some 15 or 16 of them, and it could be hundreds who are in the coalition, should be hundreds. And the larger communities should be thousands of people, because the coalition's job is to learn and educate and break down those public myths. Learn and educate. That's their entire job description. But a group of them called the steering team roll up their sleeves and represent the work in making certain that the policies and the procedures and the expectations that are put into place are followed locally. And as funding becomes available, it's the position of the model, of the framework, and what we should be funding is not just local programs, but local comprehensive plans. A series of programs that deal with not just the service needs, which are obvious on housing, education, employment, behavioral health, but more importantly, those things that help address an individual's criminality, called criminogenic needs. How they think, who they hang around with, how they act, how they see themselves, their attitudes, their beliefs. These aren't the kind of things that you send somebody someplace and they come back with a place to stay or a job or whatever. These are things that are more psychologically based, and so you've got to have a mix of programs that address criminogenic needs and programs that address the physical service needs. I say all that because the other representative very critical to this work is Todd Hamilton, who is the chair, the co-chair of the local steering team here that was put together as a result of CAPARC buying into the model, including the framework and all of its details. And what we're doing this period of time is we're looking toward our colleagues at Metamorphosis and all of those of you here to make certain that we've got the broadest possible representation in the most logical, efficient order to be able to do the work in the best possible way. And that may require some changes, it may require some expansion, it may require some shrinkage. God only knows. But one thing we do know is that the people who are here today are the right people to begin to have these conversations. And so Todd Hamilton, who's the co-chair of that steering team, sits on the state team that oversees the LA-PRI. I'll be describing that in some detail. So I'm going to spend hour and a half or so, I guess, talking with you about LA-PRI. I've got a PowerPoint to do. I'm going to turn it over to Roger Shabilsky. And remember, Shabilsky is the way to pronounce his name, because when you read the way it's spelled, it's one of those incomprehensible names that we just love to make fun of all the time. Roger is, and he won't say this, I will, he is the preeminent expert on the science of implementation. And he knows why these efforts fail to be able to put into place in such a way regionally and statewide, they work the way they're supposed to. They're developed with fidelity in mind, but they're implemented and all hell breaks loose and stuff just doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. A researcher friend of ours, Ed Ryan from Ohio, published a document, a research document, and there's a quotable quote in there, and it is, implementation is the bane of reentry. I'm not sure what bane is. I think it's one of the things you throw at a werewolf. They're coming at you, but it doesn't sound good to me. And in that nugget is really the truth of it. As hard as it is to develop the framework and develop the policies and create the organizational structures, as hard as that is, it pales in comparison to the difficulty of actually implementing the stuff with fidelity, an important word. So, as part of a community, a statewide community of LA-PRI parishes that have committed to the model and the framework, you're part of a much larger effort than what will be occurring here. And know that there are some parishes that have been working well ahead of you in a much organized fashion. St. Tammany, for example, which is the most incarcerative parish in the state, which is the most incarcerative state in the Union, which is the most incarcerative country in the world. So, St. Tammany is the most incarcerated place on the planet Earth. When I'm in Covington, I remember that. I just walk very straight and narrow in Covington. But that's important to know because Covington is really pulled themselves together well, have a good steering team, have done the work, they're very well organized, and that's the place where we're going to be testing out the model. I'll come back to that. But as my larger point here, that as part of a larger statewide effort, and particularly looking to the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Steering Team Association, that's an ungodly name. The acronym's pretty good. It's LA-PRI. If it's LA-PRI, which has got a little French sound to it, then LA-PRI is the association. And we'll be able to learn from each other. What works well in some communities may not work as well in others. And we can learn from each other. And that's how we'll be moving forward. Make sense? So to begin with, I've mentioned the vision. And I've touched on these particular points here. We have a model which is very broadly and very deeply endorsed by not just the Department of Corrections, but the governor himself has endorsed it. We have about an 8 or 10 minute taped video of the governor that we can send around to folks that shows his dedication to this. And it's great to hear Governor Edwards say these things. He understands this stuff very, very well. Not surprisingly, we're also endorsed by other public policy groups, Louisiana Smart on Crime, Louisiana Right on Crime, Louisianans for Prison Alternatives, which could be called Louisiana Left on Crime. And if there was a group called Louisiana Center on Crime, we'd be right in the middle of that too. There aren't a whole lot of downsides to what we're talking about here. Improved individualized case plans is not controversial. We were endorsed by the Justice Reinvestment Task Force, unanimous, to be the comprehensive evidence-based framework through which prisoner reentry reforms will take place in the state of Louisiana. And so it's very widely, broadly, deeply, uniformly accepted as the way we'll do business. Eventually, there will be nothing called LA-PRI. The I will drop out. It won't be an initiative. It'll be the way we do business. How long will that take? It's up to the state. But following those 5 parishes that represent 40% of everybody in prison, there's another 7 behind them that represent the next 30%. So in the state of Louisiana, when you're working with 12 parishes, you've got upwards of 65% of everybody who's in prison. And if you can have an impact on those 12, you will start to see the statewide recidivism rate goes down. The expectation is we will become statewide. We will move from parish to regions, and regions will cover the state. And that's in the next 3 or 4 years. This workshop has many multiple parts. We're not going to do all of this today. We're going to focus on kind of fundamentals, a little bit on evidence-based practice. We're going to look at the framework, and we're going to look at organizational structures. And we'll get that far. With this information in hand, you all can decide whether you want to go deeper at another time. Does that look like a reasonable agenda then? Yes. So let's start with some fundamentals. This is going to be important for not only the work that happens, but it's a little bit of a setup for Roger to do his presentation a little bit later this morning. So as I mentioned, evidence-based principles are those approaches that research has shown have a demonstrable, statistically relevant impact on reducing individual criminality, and by virtue of that, the potential to reduce recidivism for an entire population of people, whether that's in a community or statewide. And this document here, which y'all, if you want versions of this PowerPoint, we'll make these available to you. You can take notes if you'd like. The fine print down here is one of the best documents that's ever been published about evidence-based practices. I keep it on the side of my desk. 2009, sounds like a little bit old, but it's still extraordinarily relevant. And they produced this great looking helix here, looks like DNA to me, that puts all the evidence-based practices in one diagram and kind of gives you an idea of what they are. You get that picture. But what I like to do when I do the training is I like to divide them up into evidence-based practices that affect organizations and evidence-based practices that affect clients, because there's some distinction between them. And they're somewhat interactive, of course. But one of the main few here have to do with what we all consider the main part of the work, which is improved reentry plans. But we have to target the right people with our scarce resources. The right people that we want to target are the people who generally don't show up at our place, knocking in our door and asking for help. They're not the ones that come dressed right. They're not the ones that are respectful. They're the ones that are non-compliant with bad attitudes, and you got to track them down, and they're non-compliant. And they fail again and again and again. And we have to find those individuals that have a moderate to high risk of recidivating, a moderate to high risk of committing new crimes, we have to find them before they get out of prison and target them and meet with them and work with them so that we give them the best chance possible to be successful before they hit the street. And with their peer associations and their criminal thinking and their records, which keep them out of jobs and housing, and their attitudes and behaviors that keep them out of behavioral health programs, we give them the best possible chance of hitting the ground on strong legs. In order to do this, we have to assess their risk, we have to assess their needs, and we do that through the use of actuarial, predictive, risk and need assessment instruments that have been proven again and again and again to be quite accurate in trying to figure out who is more likely to go back to prison and who is not. Moderate to high risk. If we divided this room up into 3 groups of people, low risk, these folks right here in the front looking at them is high risk. Whoa, man, they're tough. Moderate risk, the larger group back here, who ends up showing up at our programs because they want some help? Who we really need to try to figure out who they are. The high and the low. Now let me tell you something, and I have to use Bonnie. You just happen to be sitting in the seat that is the highest risk, highest need person in the room, and you're in the seat where we put the sociopaths and the psychopaths. Sorry.
I'm pretty unpredictable.
Pretty unpredictable. And you're with her. Not quite as bad, but you're close. When we're doing risk and need assessment, we want to know who these folks are because we're not going to be successful with them. These are career criminals that are beyond our pale. We need to try. We need to watch them. But these are the people that are going to repeat. It's going to be very difficult to work with them. Our sweet spot is the low highs, so to speak, and the moderates. Not that we want to box anybody out, but we got to be clear. If we've only got 5 places for people to live, and we give up all those slots, and this is going to, really, this is incredible. I'm going to say this. Roger happens to be in a seat that's the lowest of the low. Lowest risk, lowest need. I know him. I know that's not true. But I'll tell you, look at the guy. I mean, the suit comes up in time, always delivers, not complain. Yes, sir, yes. He brought me this apple this morning. I mean, we love this guy. These are the guys we like on our caseload. We like in our programs. We don't need to spend a lot of time with Roger. As we start to move up this group, we start to get to Pastor Jetson. If we don't work carefully with these guys, they're going to go the wrong direction. Their risk is going to go up. They're going to be over here. So we got the low, high risk. We got the moderate risk. We got the higher end. When we think about risk and needs, risk, pretty static, meaning hard to change it. How old were you when you committed your first crime? How many times you been in prison? How many times you been non-compliant? What's your rap sheet look like? Right? You don't change that stuff. That's static. The new risk assessment also includes things you can change. What are you doing now? Are you in program? Do you attend in a synagogue, church, a temple? Are you employed? Are you in counseling? Those are also risk factors. And when we engage people who are in the low end of the high risk and the moderate risk in those types of programs, we can help manage their risk so that the risk assessment that predicts they'll go back doesn't happen. We're managing their risk so that the prediction doesn't happen. A lot of folks talk about risk reduction. We want to reduce their risk. Well, it's really more about managing the risk rather than reducing it. Because if you're in this group here, in prison 4 times, non-compliant 5 times, in and out of jail 15 times, and God only knows what you do. Her rap sheet's so long I can't even summarize it. that weight of those static risk factors are very hard to overcome. These folks can be involved in school and be out and free and functioning and become ministers. And when we do a risk assessment, the weight of those static scores will still put them in high risk. We point to them and say they beat the odds. We're managing that risk. Hard to reduce it. Less the case with the lower risk folks whose risk you can probably modify and change over time. The whole idea of risk and need assessment is for us to understand as a community of the 600, 800 people that are getting out every month, where do people fall? Where do we need to spend our time and attention? Who do we need to meet before they get released? Where is the sweet spot? And it's right here. We don't talk about excluding populations, we talk about prioritizing populations from highest risk and highest need to lowest need. And if the resources hold out, maybe we can help Roger. But frankly, if we just let Roger bounce as he will through the community, he'll probably be okay. Because Roger has, these guys don't have. He's got a lighter record. He's got more success in his history. He's got a better attitude and a better belief than they do about themselves and how they fit into society and their chances for success. That brings us to a huge issue of positive reinforcement. Every opportunity we have to engage with a returning citizen, former prisoner, is an opportunity to help improve their attitudes and beliefs. Every engagement. If we believe philosophically in everything we do, in the way we carry ourselves, in the way we act with returning citizens full of respect, with their success at the heart of everything we do, we can help them improve their attitudes and beliefs about themselves, how they fit in to society, their chances for success, their dedication and their motivation, and what we all know in the work that we do, that it isn't programs that get people to change, it's relationships. And every single one of us, I've done this, we won't take the time to do it. Call me out a couple of names of people that change your life. What has affected your life? I say, what has affected your life? You're not going to tell me where you went to school. You're not going to tell me what church you went to. You're going to talk about your pastor, your teacher, your blessed mother, whoever, right? That's what each of us needs to be able to do in all of our interactions. And it's not because it makes good sense from an ethical and moral standpoint. It's that. But it also makes sense because the science says that positive reinforcement helps reduce individual and therefore group criminality. The ratio of positive to negative comments should be 4 or 5 to 1. And if I got my high risk, high need coming in, kind of non-compliant, showing up late again, and the first thing I say to her is negative. Why did you miss work yesterday? She's backing off. She ain't listening. She got an attitude right off the bat. It ain't going to go very well. If I say, God, I'm so glad that you came here today. A little late, but glad you're here, and glad that you reported last week that you moved without permission. And I got to find 4 or 5 positive things to be able to say to her, which means I better know that stuff. Right. It better be in the case files. What does she do well? Are you still doing your tutoring down at the school? Yeah, I'm still doing it. I missed a couple times. I still got a couple of kids there. Well, that's great. You got to do the positive stuff. The ears open up and say, let's talk about this bad drug test you took. What's going on? He's going to talk to you. Because your ears are open up because it's positive reinforcement. And then I want to make sure, both as individuals and as a group, that I understand who I'm working with well enough by risk and need that I can target interventions. Target interventions individually. Because I know that what I do with you is going to be different than what I do with you from a lot of different reasons. Not just because it's man and woman. There's some big differences there.
but also because of culture and also because of history. But more specifically, you're both in the same risk level, but you got different types of needs, you got different learning styles. We have to understand these clients so clearly that we can help them understand themselves, and they need to understand what risk and need assessment is, and they need to be part of that and trained and taught about risk and need assessment, because it's not something that we're doing to them, which is the way it usually looks, but it's something that we're doing with them. And if I'm at this table here, I'm sorry, you guys, you're going to do well. These three here, I want them to know why they've got to report more frequently and why I'm concerned about their potential failure because of what the risk assessment tells me. Likewise, I want these folks to know here, I'm not going to give you all that much because you're likely going to do better than others. And people need to know that. They need to be educated. That's what these coalitions do. They learn and they educate. They learn and they educate. It gets right down to the clients. When we think about these evidence-based practices at the organizational level, it becomes very clear. We need to skill train. Any organization that's doing this work needs to be able to understand and repeat what I just said about risk and need assessment and the driving of individual case plans. Positive reinforcement, individual targeting of interventions, skill training. Skill training isn't show up for a training. Skill training is show up for a training, learn a skill, exhibit the skill, be observed with the skill, give feedback on the observation, retrain. Research says if you want to change staff behavior, minimum of 7 interventions over the course of 3 years and you can change staff behavior. Anything less than that, odds are they ain't going to get that skill. Well, I don't have the money for that. I'm going to do motivational interviewing. I just got money for them to show up to one place. Well, guess what? It ain't going to work. People are going to go back to the way that they did business. So you've got to skill train. That takes money. That's one of the reasons we form coalitions and we form implementation steering teams and we form associations and we adopt a framework and a model and we are resolute in each of our communities and in the state as a whole. This is what we do. This is what we need. And we can prove that we're reducing individual criminality and the savings that we produce need to come back our way. That's our third objective. Save money, get money, and spend it the way we need to spend it on resources. So, as a community, we can intervene organizationally with what are we going to do with a group of high risk, higher need, moderate risk, moderate need, lower risk, higher need. How are we going to design our interventions to be able to hit these groups with priorities, with not the deepest package of service available, but how are we going to take advantage of the money that's going to be coming our way organizationally to explain how we're going to target our interventions for the entire community. And that will be, according to the model, those that are high and moderate risk with the highest needs. And if we can keep them from recidivating, we will lower the recidivism rate. It's a tough thing to try to figure out, well, what do you do with the low risk who are knocking on our door all the time? Well, here's the thing. As we move into the prison system, and the men, beginning with the men, are moved to a location, the West Baton Rouge ReEntry Center, 3 months before their release. Those are going to be the high to moderate folks that we're going to work with. And if we use that opportunity to work with them, to line them up with those resources, they get them first. That's what we have to do. We got to get them connected with y'all so that they get in line for those resources first. In order to do that, we're following this huge issue, probably to me the most important issue up here, is engaging communities in a realistic educational way. The Department of Corrections does not own prisoner reentry. The Department of Corrections is the fundamental partner that is responsible for the majority of the resources that we have. But at the end of the day, they're working with our citizens who are returning. Reentry is ours. And the collaboration that we have with the Department of Corrections is very, very positive. And they're at the table. And so we know when we have co-chairs of a local steering team, we have a community representative, but we also have a parole representative. And we also have a representative from either the local reentry center or the prison or the jail. And those are the ways that we engage the communities, and eventually it's completely owned. You've got policies, procedures, etc. We want to measure performance, what's important. We want to reduce violations. We certainly want to reduce revocations. We want to increase the number of reentry accountability plans that we have, particularly with the high and moderate risk prisoners. We want to measure the number of people that get moved from the state prisons into the West Baton Rouge Reentry Center that get these plans. We want to measure the degree that the policies that have been developed are implemented. If you can count it, and it's important, you got to count it and then report it. You have to measure performance, and then everyone has to be clear about it. And we all are working in the same direction. We're all in the same boat. All rowing the same way. And I can tell you without any hesitation whatsoever, the Department of Corrections, I mentioned the governor, the Department of Corrections Secretary Jimmy LeBlanc, Red Covington, the head of parole, Pete Freeman, head of prisons, Seth Smith. These folks have been working with us on this model for 2.5 years. They're all in. Notwithstanding the difficulty they have to take this battleship-sized agency called the Department of Corrections and slowly, surely kind of move it and turn it. But they're all in. I couldn't ask, I do not have an example of a state that has bought into it more critically than what the state of Louisiana has done. In fact, when I go to other states and train, I'm in Delaware, Arizona, recently was in Georgia, Alaska, a couple other places. I talked about Louisiana. I show them the materials that we've developed here because you've gone the furthest of any state to organize your system. So good for the state. Any questions or comments about these evidence-based practices? This is the fundamental stuff. Make sense to everybody? Questions or comments? Yes, sir.
So under the organizational EVPs, measure performance, you rattled off a litany of indicators. At what point do you become clear on what those are?
I think we're clear now. The question becomes, how do we implement that here, and who do we implement it with? So good question. What we're doing to implement the LA-PRI is we're doing it with a small group of people in each of the parishes to begin with, to kick the tires. Probably 20 or less prisoners who will be identified prior to getting moved to the West Baton Rouge Reentry Center, and it was at those 20 or fewer where we'll begin the process. By the time we get to that, which will be in 2018, we're already able to communicate what's important. I'm going to share with you a policy document that lays some of that out. But we're going to be measuring that performance with those 20. We're going to be able to compare the 20 that were released to East Baton Rouge to the 20 that were released to St. Tammany and Orleans and Caddo, so we can do some cross-parish comparisons of those major indicators: fewer violations, more restitution, less crime, fewer returns to prison. That's a lot of what we look at. I've got ample documentation. In fact, what will result from this session is your ability to access these documents so you can see all the detail See all this stuff I've got up here? If I were to hand all this stuff out, you'd say, oh man, this is crazy. This guy just gave me a stack this big. But we'll have all that accessible, which includes those details on that. And we'll be able then to know the degree to which a community can handle 20, and then another 20, and then 30, and then 40, while at the same time we're testing out something that we don't know in this state. We don't know how many people in prison are moderate, high, or low risk. We don't know. We got some ideas, but we don't know because they've never been tested. We suspect, like a lot of states, the largest group is the moderate risk group, which is why they're in the middle anyway. But exactly what those numbers are, we're not sure yet. We have all the things in motion to be able to do that with the new Tiger risk need assessment instrument that's being developed, but it's not fully implemented. Pam?
So in the world of pre-post assessment, is the risk assessment a living document?
Yes.
So that you do it all along?
Yes, it needs to be done intermittently. There's something called the case logic model that lays out what's expected through the use of the risk assessment instrument development. There's this thing that just goes on, phase 1, phase 2. It's very detailed, not implemented at all yet, but it's intermittent. It's driven by some periodic reviews, plus should be driven by incidents. Positive incidents mean you've graduated, something good's happened, you got your job or whatever, and negative incidents that you've been non-compliant and you're busted back or whatever. Those will affect your risk. And importantly, it needs to be interactive with communities. It isn't the Department of Correction has it and it's ours. It's that people have to have access to it. Access of information is one of the most difficult things to overcome with state agencies. Rules, regulations, and then you got the lawyers. How many lawyers do we have here? Let me speak freely. Lawyers get involved, holy cow. It's tough. But we have to have this, and so what I take a tack on is I say, you know what? Under what conditions can we share this information? Don't tell me no, we can't share it. Tell me under what conditions we can. And the answer is, well, if we created a website and we had certain information didactic, we could, well, let's do that. Let's not wait for a brand new management information system to be developed in the Department of Corrections. They've been working on that for what, 5 years, 6 years? Right? It's years away from being in. We can't wait for that. We've got to take temporary measures to be able to access information, including, to answer your question, what is the risk need assessment of this individual we're working with? I need to know everything you know. I need to know everything you know about her. High risk, high need, coming back from my community, 3 times out, back within 30 days. I don't want that to happen again. I want to know all about it. All right? This is some tough stuff to try to get worked out. So far, so good. When you do apply the evidence-based practices, you can improve recidivism by double digits. In the state of Michigan, we improved the success rate by 36%. We had 1 out of every 2 people failing on parole and returning to prison within 3 years. 1 out of every 2. And we reduced that to 1 out of every 3. A 36% improvement. We were spending $274 million a year on the people who failed. People say, we don't have any money. I said, well, you know, we got lots of money. We're spending $274 million on our failures. Maybe we should spend that money so they don't fail. State of Louisiana, oh, we don't have any money. It's a poor state. Yeah, well, you're spending $172 million a year housing people in local jails and paying sheriffs 3 hots and a cot. Thank God the sheriffs are there doing it. Otherwise, I don't know where these men would be. But that's $172 million. When you apply some of those resources to these evidence-based practices, you can reduce, and you are proven to reduce recidivism, but you have to do it with fidelity. On individual cases, with her and him and her, y'all, and then a community as a whole, the group that's coming back. We have to join forces organizationally which is why we form coalitions and steering teams. There's room for all of God's children. And if we're exclusive, we will fail. We've got to figure that out. That's where metamorphosis, I think, comes in a big way. How do we build that capacity and make sure that people own this? That's where LA-PRI comes in a big way. So the proof is in the pudding. And I will guarantee you that if we implement this with fidelity, we will see a reduction in the prisoner recidivism rate. I absolutely guarantee you. There's that big if in there about fidelity, you may have noticed. So the model itself was developed from something called the Transition from Prison to Community Model, TPC, developed by the National Institute of Corrections about 2006. They published a handbook. It's still accessible. It contains a lot of the information I'm sharing with you here. And what it does is it breaks reentry down into some biteable chunks. I have a time check. 5 after 3. This is the TPC model. It's got 3 phases. It's got 7 key decision points. And the purpose of this model is to improve each of the decisions that are made so that the decisions are better and they're more reflective of the evidence we know about how to improve individual case plans and how to improve systems. So we break this big thing called reentry down into 3 pieces. These 3 phases come from Jeremy Travis, who wrote a book in 2005 called But They All Come Back, The Challenge of Prisoner Reentry in the United States. He talked about these types of phases, and we've adopted that. Jeremy Travis, by the way, is the new vice president of the Arnold Foundation. He gives away more money for criminal justice reform than anybody. So if you're going to write down a little note, just write a $ down there and write Arnold next to it. We've got to figure out how to get them in the state. But Jeremy Travis is what many people consider kind of the grandfather, the godfather of modern prisoner reentry in the country. 3 phases. You're getting into prison, now you're getting ready to get out from day 1. You're in prison, get over it. You're hereby punished. Keep your eye on the prize. Let's get you out at your earliest possible time. How do we do that? You participate in programs and you're compliant. So the first set of decisions is, how do we assess them and classify them? Well, what is it about? When we're running a prison system, we want to make sure that the high-risk people are living together and not mixing up with the low-risk people. If we end up with our dormitory and we take our 5 low-risk people here and we move them in with this group of 7 high-risk people, what's going to happen? What happens to these folks? You mean that the lower-risk people don't bring the higher-risk people? No? Well, you're absolutely right. I was in Montana, and in Montana they had problems with incarceration, and they had a spike in their recidivism rate. I was examining what they were doing, and I came across this fact that they took their highest risk security prison that had empty beds, and they started putting their low-risk people in those beds. And they scratched their head and said, we don't know why these people are coming back so much more frequently. And I said, do you think maybe it's because who they're hanging out with? The evidence-based practice? The criminogenic need for antisocial peers? I have a point there. Spike in recidivism. $100 million because of not understanding what? Implementation fidelity. They had a policy that said you don't mix the populations. They didn't follow the policy. So you got to implement with fidelity. I want to classify and I want to assess, and I want to know not just what risk level you are, but I want to know your needs, because I got a few choices of where I can send you. I want to send you a place where you're going to get the programming you need. Difficult to do. Departments of Corrections don't have the best programming, and those that have programming, when money gets tight, that's the first thing that goes, because if you're going to choose between security and classification and programming, what do you think will win out 100% of the time? Security and classification. You've got to keep things safe. I don't blame them for that. It's one of the reasons that we have such a high return rate. Those first sets of decisions, assessment, classification, and prison programming should be captured in a transition. In a transition accountability plan. In the general literature here, that transition accountability plan, or a TAP in Louisiana, that is called the ReEntry accountability plan, or the REET. And I am suspicious there's a biblical overtone to that. The REET, ReEntry plan. That ReEntry plan should communicate to the prisoner, to the people who work in the system, what's expected. If I do this, I get this. If I don't do this, I don't do this. And if I keep my nose clean and I am compliant and I attend my programming, I'm going to move through my security levels and I'm going to be released at the earliest time. That motivates me, and it's in writing, and you can hold it. I went to a prison in Michigan. I was the chief deputy director of the prison system in Michigan for years. And I went into a facility, and as I did, I asked all the staff to leave, and I met with a bunch of prisoners. And in the prison unit I was in, folks had a medical history of drug addiction and a mental health history. And of these men that I met with, there were about 7 of them, 5 of them were holding these gray folders to their chests throughout the entire meeting. Sat down, I said, so how's it going? They talked to me a little bit. A couple guys talked more than others. What's the most important thing that's going on? Well, you know, we're getting introduced to people in the community, people caring about us. They talked about people caring about us. And at some point in the interview, I said to them, I said, so what is that you're clutching? And this guy, I'll never forget the look on his face. He was so wonderful. He looked at me and he said, this is my new life. In here, I have all my letters I've sent to the employers. I have my resume. I have my journal, and it was a thick folder. I had my re-entry plan. This is my new life. This is where I keep everything. He owned it. He carried it. And what the staff did was make sure that he was working on that. So this idea that you get ready right away for release, prisoner reentry happens the first day you're committed into the state prison system. It actually should start at sentencing, when we've got access to the people before they get uprooted and sent somewhere, and we can get copies of their IDs and the stuff that they're going to lose in the 8 years that they're down, but that's a whole other story. No state has ever been able to do that well. But that transition planning happens here, and then immediately before release is the second phase. And when that second phase hits, we want to make sure that people are really, really ready to go home. That's when we move these men, beginning with the men. We're going to be working with women. The women are all housed in one location way up north. I don't even know if it's in this state, it's so far northeast. So a little more difficult because there's fewer women, but we're committed to working with women as well. Yeah. Well, the reentry center up there, in the old juvenile facility. They found a facility that they liked, and so they moved all the women in nowhere near their communities at all. It's what departments of correction. What's that? Is that it? So, when we move the men to West Baton Rouge, beginning with small numbers, we're going to start doing this release preparation. And this is what we have to guide us. These are the kinds of materials, I'm just going to mention them here. This isn't a real deep dive in paperwork here. But we have a Department of Corrections policy that indicates what's expected. The Secretary will sign this soon. Once we've got all the policies lined up to it, it's the overarching Louisiana prisoner reentry policy, and it indicates in writing what's expected here, here, and here.
Well, I guess that was, I had 2 questions. How would the additions to this program comply with HIPAA rules?
They'll have to comply with HIPAA rules and regulations. It's easier to do than folks make it out.
Try to figure out what they're going to see
very good question. Do you hear a question back? Are we going to at some point be given rosters of people that are getting out so we know? And the answer is yes. Right now, nobody knows that. Nobody knows everybody who's getting out of prison and what their risk and need levels are and what their date of release is. Some people know some things, some people know other things. There's no system in place. We don't even know right now how many people are in prison from East Baton Rouge and what their risk and need levels are, so we have an idea, let alone when they're getting out and at what pace. This is all part of what we're trying to improve. We cannot implement this overarching policy without getting clear about that, and we can't expect the community to do a comprehensive reentry plan unless they know what is the average number of releases per month, of not the highest of the high, we do want to know that, but the lower end of the highs that we're going to work with, our sweet spot in the moderates, so that we know who's getting out, we know who's going to be moved to the center, we know when they're going to be moved to the center, and when we get there, we're welcome with open arms, and they don't say, who are you with again? The Wood? We ain't got nothing in here. I'm sorry. Right? It's got to get tight. That's why we're doing the cohorts, the testing, to try to get tight on it. So as we start to implement this, this is the general layout of the model. I'm going to give you some more specifics. Know that we have this overarching policy that lays this stuff out, and that overarching policy references what the outcome expectations are that you had asked about, Pastor. It lays out what the organizational structures are, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Lays out the case logic about how the cases are supposed to flow. Describes how we expect for cases to be managed collaboratively with parole, following collaborative case management. We have reentry accountability planning documentation that's expected to be completed, and other types of documentation. It's all captured in that policy. And in one sense, when we think about implementation, implementation can be simply put, we're going to implement this overarching policy. I'm going to touch on some of these, and you will have access to that policy in all of its detail. But I'm telling you that what that policy represents is this idea that these transition plans, Pam, you had asked about the risk assessment being living, breathing, yes, but part of a broader living and breathing document, which is a reentry plan. Because when you're in prison, let's redo the room, phase 1, these folks are all in prison. Phase 2, these folks have moved closer to home. Phase 3, these folks are in the community. We need to know what's happening in phase 1. What does that transition reentry plan look like? What programming have they participated in? Who's visiting them? Who's connected with them? What do they got going? What are the pluses? What are the risks, right? And then closer to release, how do we put that together and make sure that members of the community have access to be able to meet with the men and women coming out, understanding who they are, what they need, and saying, I'm going to get you pre-enrolled or enrolled. So you hit the ground on day 1. I want to know, with this group here who are just getting ready to get out, I want to know what you're doing the first 2 minutes after you're out, first 2 hours, first 2 days, first 2 weeks, first 2 months. And if we're clear about that, the odds are greater you're going to do well, because failure begins immediately and then slowly but surely ebbs into this. That's what this policy dictates. How do we go from a policy that says we're going to do it to getting it done? That's a long path. One thing we know, in places we've worked, you don't do it with massive numbers of people, you will fail. You've got to kick the tires and test it out. We were down in St. Tammany. The first group of men was 11. It didn't follow the model very well, frankly. The men weren't clear as to why they were there. There weren't reentry plans ready to prepare. We got down to one guy, and that guy said, I don't need anything, I'm good. So we're going to start over, and we're going to get it right this time. We're not going to spread into Caddo or East Baton Rouge until we do. And it's got to work well. We can't make this work with 10, 15, or 20 God knows we're never gonna make it work with 200, or whatever that number is, because I really don't know the number. I suspect in the state of Louisiana, very strong suspicion, we have a very large number of low-risk people who are in prison. Very large number. Who may have more needs, but probably don't represent that seriousness of a risk. That's just a suspicion. So, once that plan is started while they're still in prison, that reentry accountability plan, they're released, they meet with their parole officer, and then we continue that plan in terms of what the expectations are for reporting, attending different programs, etc. That's what it's supposed to be, and there is a reentry accountability planning document that I am told I will have in my hands on the 23rd of February when I meet in St. Tammany with the group of people that are looking at what happened with this first cohort, saying, man, all that stuff you promised, didn't happen. Well, you know, what did we learn? We learned it didn't happen because different individuals didn't follow through. Let's tighten that up. I think we will. So that is the major overarching policy, or framework. Here's another depiction of it as you kind of move through it, right? With the idea that you've got this transition team in a local parish structure, you got a coalition, which is everybody, as many as you can get under one roof. And then you got a steering team that's committed to the model of making sure the policies are followed and training happens and committee work is developed. And as part of that steering team, you have a number of individuals that are committed to actually working directly with the prisoners. Not everybody, but maybe representatives, so that if this is the full range here of community organizations that have got some type of services, they may designate a couple of people and give them all the information they need about pre-enrollment, enrollment rules, etc. They interact, and then they do case planning outside the community, so you don't have huge numbers of people going in and out of prison.
So, Bonnie Hawkins from Social Works Institute, glad to be here. The question I had was, I'm hearing you talk about two plans. One of them is an individual plan customized to that individual returning citizen. And then you're talking about a comprehensive community plan. Do you have at this point an idea of how those two things work together to identify and allocate resources?
Yes.
Assets, you know, housing, transportation, and things.
So the Community Comprehensive Reentry Plan, which will be unveiled in the next 2 to 3 weeks, depicts how you intend to work with the individuals getting out. So it's a more comprehensive view of what's going on in the community, how your steering team is going to be working hand in glove with the Department of Corrections, in this case with the West Baton Rouge Reentry Center, to work with the individuals to do improved individualized case planning, and as a result of committee work for education, employment, behavioral health, housing, what resources you have available, what barriers you have to get those resources matched with the people, especially prior to release, rules, regulations, etc. Not money, barriers. And then third, funding barriers. It's our intent, it's certainly my intent, that the comprehensive plan not only lays out those assets, barriers, and gaps, but is the place where you lay out how you plan on using any money that comes your way. Money you've raised and leveraged, or other money that's coming our way through justice reinvestment or larger grants or whatever. And so the comprehensive plan is what the community does, including but not limited to the work that they do with the individuals. Make sense? And we're in our cycle. We should be at that comprehensive planning level now, but we've had a few setbacks.
And what is the nexus, the location at which the comprehensive community plan is actually developed and generated?
It's developed by the steering team on behalf of the coalition. And in that steering team, in the model, you have staffing. If you don't have local staffing, this won't work.
So we're talking about the steering team that Todd leads at this point.
At this point, yes.
So,
And they're and the various committees that work from that, the housing, employment. The document itself, in the states, other states I've worked with, we haven't quite figured this fully out yet, but it's not all that complicated, is that steering team is making decisions collaboratively about their priorities and looking at the assets and figuring out how they work, and the staff person is putting all that stuff together in a document to be able to submit it. And in Michigan, where we first had this, because we were closing prisons and taking 10 cents on a dollar from that to reinvest, we had $57 million in our fund. It's quite a bit of money. So we used the comprehensive plan as a comprehensive plan budget request application. So it was two things at once. We need to be ready to be able to do that once the first cohorts have been tested and we see how it's working. Now, we might be able to apply that comprehensive planning to that cohort. It might be a good way to do it. I got to make sure I got the buy-in from all the stakeholders. The Department of Corrections does have some ideas on how they want folks to apply for money from them, and it doesn't include this, what I'm talking about here. So we got a little work to do. But the entity that is responsible for the hands-on, making certain that everything is working the way it's supposed to, is the steering team and those three co-chairs, and logically the chairs of these committees would be on that steering team as well. And in this community, that is the steering team of a broad coalition, getting broader all the time, and we got some work to do to try to figure out what, with the work you're doing, what that's going to look like in the future, etc. So we're moving on that now. Does that answer your question?
yes.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Mary Ann Mason. I work at Healthy Flu, one of the Medicaid managed care companies, as a behavioral health liaison. But my question is really more towards what I do personally, which is I'm part of the Louisiana Association of Peer Support. And my question is, where does peer support come into that model? And, you know, because you were talking about how, you know, we don't want to put the people with the most trouble with those with the least. But in my experience, a few years ago, I went through Louisiana Certified Peer Specialist training, and there were a number of people who were in recovery as well as having committed crimes that, you know, they were doing well, but sometimes that lived experience can really make a difference.
I think it's a huge issue, and I've got to tell you that all the written documentation I have does not do that any type of justice. And these things need to be improved to make sure that what I'm about to say is reflected. In the organizational work I've done historically, I ran a place called, you'll love this, the Ex-Convicts Organization. They named it. It was back in the 70s, a while ago. I was the only person that hadn't been in prison who was in the organization. We used nothing but a peer support model. And in fact, the folks that we used more pronounced were folks that had done a good bit of time, had failed many times and succeeded, and those are the people I hired to be able to do the work. And how we end up bringing mentoring into this, the good news is it's going to be up to every community to do that in the way that they think is most efficient, and it should be no holds barred, and the department has shown a great deal of respect for making certain that former prisoners are involved in this process, both at the structural level and then in the operations level. So I think that you can help lead that charge here, and perhaps this is the place that does it first and does it best. Yes, sir.
Reggie Brown from Guardian Initiative in St. Louis, Paul. Do you know if the Department of Corrections is looking at changing the rule where if you're already working in prison ministry, that you can't have contact with those prisoners once they come out?
No, I don't know.
that would be helpful.
Yeah.
For example, we think one of our guys fell through the cracks. In Gardere, we have this coalition that we're talking about with behavioral health, the churches and so forth. And we had information from one of the ministers that one of the guys was getting out in February. We got this in December. I was perfectly happy to go and talk to him or to contact him, but I'm already doing prison ministry, so I've fallen into that loophole where I can't, you know, have contact inside the prison and outside the prison. So, and unfortunately, the other folks in our coalition, they didn't contact him either. Whatever reason it is, I don't know, but they didn't contact him either. So we think he fell through the cracks. I think he got out in February. We're mid-February. We don't know where he is. So if we can change that rule so that the people that are already committed to doing prison ministry and are there, we know that they have a vested interest. We know that they want to be involved. Let us do the work when they come out also.
Sounds like a very important point, and I would say that the way that this should work is that when you have your coalition meetings, which are educational, you know, big event, perhaps quarterly, that may be a time to talk about that kind of stuff broadly, but more specifically, you want to make sure that's on the agenda of the steering team. Steering team meeting should be open, should be time for some comment, and that needs to be on their list, not perhaps to signify a desire to change statewide policy, but to begin with, we want to do something that's going to assist our community. Let's try this out. Under what conditions can we have that rule be exempt from that rule? Can we do it with one case, two cases, three cases, just see how it works? And that's kind of the interaction that we would need. Let me hit another couple of points. Can I have a time check? Almost done.
28.
Okay, good. So when you take that transition from prison to community initiative and you move it forward 5 years, you end up being able to increase the detail within that 3 phases and 7 decision points. And what we know is that if you want to be successful with returning prisoners in phase 1, you need to attend to their physical care, their mental health care, their substance abuse treatment, children and family support, behaviors and attitudes, education, and technical. There's a lot of stuff that we need to attend to. Same is true for that phase while they're in the place nearest to their home, and the same is true at the end in adhering to these principles. This work will take at least as long to implement as it's taken to create the system the way that we know it now. This is the long haul. What we've managed to do in every state I've worked is at least prioritize some of these and focus on them. And in every state I've worked, every single one of the 12 I've worked, the priorities are employment, housing, and behavioral health. And in this state, added education, because when they did some reviews of some risk assessment information from years back, they found that people that were successful in educational programming in the prison had a double-digit higher success rate than people who didn't. They don't know why, but they know that education is important. It could be because the education of the prisoners going in is quite low, and so you give them a jolt of education. But this is the full model. This is the full framework, and for each of the priorities. Well, for each of those, there's a great deal of information. See the size of this? This is a 90-page guidebook that assists local jurisdictions in looking at what the research tells us about each of those particular points about 2 things. 1, how do you improve individualized case plans? And 2, how do you help improve systems? So in housing, it isn't just about what do we do to try to link people with housing, the importance of housing, how you talk about that, which everybody's pretty clear about it. But how do you actually change housing to increase that resource? And what do the folks that are in charge of housing have to understand? Well, in the state and local models that we use, this is the state organizational structure. This guidebook is what they've been working from for the past 3 years to put the framework together. It's also the guidebook that is worked with locally. And they made certain that when they've got representatives for housing, for example, it's Nicole Swayze, who's the executive director of the Louisiana Housing Authority. You can't get any higher than her. She is the chair of the housing committee. She's got a group of people, including parole and prison people and housing people she works with regularly, using this guidebook to understand how we improve housing systems. And she's doing that work. Each local parish, so here's a snapshot of the state organizational structure. You have a statutory reentry advisory council. Department of Corrections is offering support. Reporting to the DOC is the statewide implementation steering team. These are the representatives we have there, including representatives from each of the community-based coalitions. Who do we ask to attend? Representing the community co-chair of the steering team. So Todd Hamilton attends all the state meetings. Those committees that are formed on our priorities, housing, education, behavioral health, and employment, each of those 4 committees are what would be formed in each parish. St. Tammany formed the committees, did the work, state was meeting, doing the work. We had this great engagement, probably one of the best sessions we've had, where I asked the state committees to go to St. Tammany and meet with the local committees and set up a room with the state and the local housing, state and the local employment, etc., and they shared their notes and their information. And they said it was the best thing they ever did because they started to understand that what the state thought was happening locally wasn't happening locally. Some of the assets were not in place. And they heard a larger litany of some of the barriers and the gaps. That's how we need to roll the work. When the Louisiana LA-PRI is functional, wouldn't it be great to be able to take the housing committee from all 5 parishes and put them all together and have a learning session about housing and work with state people to say, this is what we've learned, this is where we need to go. And do that not just for housing, but do it for employment and education. That's the long path we're on for system improvement, is educated folks locally working from a framework with ways to access the literature of what works and be able to access some direction about how to improve systems so that at the end of the day we have better capability for individualized case plans. This is going to go on from now on. It's going to be a decade. Those of you who are my age, it may not happen the way we want it to in our lifetime, but those of you who are younger, you're in a really good spot in your career to be able to see this stuff through. So that's the state structure, and you got this group there, that transition team that developed this policy that references the performance expectations, the organizational structures, the case logic. That team then, and this whole structure, mirrors what happens locally. This is the local structure. You have a coalition. The steering team reports to that coalition, has the 3 co-chairs, has those representatives, not 5 people from housing, but 1, not 5 people from behavioral health, but 2, substance abuse, mental health. There is a community coordinator. Here it is Ashley Dowden, who is funded now by Wilson to begin doing the coordination on the LA-PRI. And importantly, I mentioned that transition team. If y'all were all the nonprofits in the community, who are those of you that are proficient in understanding enough of all that's available to to be able to go in, interview the prisoner while the prisoner is moved in West Baton Rouge, and start to get an idea of what the needs are, how can you pre-enroll and enroll, so that that re-entry accountability plan starts to get developed and is in a strong draft form, or a strong form, not draft, a strong form before their release. So the state structure mirrors the local structure. Yeah. Can you stand up? Do you mind? People aren't going to be able to hear you. Tell everybody who you are.
Hi, my name is Tanetta Stewart. I'm a case manager with Healthy Blue, as well as the 5 letter cake plans. And I do have a question, like I said earlier, regarding to the ATO. Within that state of Louisiana Department of Corrections, are they going to put it into where a small portion of training mental health will be implemented? Some of the community or,
We hope.
okay, because just say for instance, someone comes in for housing, and so can we offer housing? I would think some type of mental health and behavioral training would be, implemented,
Yep.
so they can know how to respond to
Yep.
inmate who may have
Yep.
bipolar depression,
Yep.
things like that. So they won't be afraid and know how to handle it.
If that's what you want to happen, that's what you can make happen. My belief is that yes, that can.
We, part of our funding through Wilson is to identify someone with mental health expertise and design a curriculum and a training program specifically for lay people and non-mental health people to identify and respond to mental health issues. You know, if someone's decompensating, who do you call, what do you do, what are the signs, those kinds of things. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so, I'm working from that perspective, but I identified immediately that if we're working with moderate to high risk, we need to make sure that everybody has the skills they need to keep themselves and their clients safe. And so that'll be a top priority in this quarter, next quarter.
And I don't want to put physical health on the back burner, because right now, mental health is, I'm very concerned with, at least on the side of suffering, and how to
Right.
put those mental and physical health.
Right. You know, it's a real challenge. I'm glad you raised that. It's a real challenge to think about priorities. We don't want to spread ourselves so thin that we're trying to get all 26 of those targets for change, the list that I showed you. We can't work with them all at once. We got priorities. States all focus on housing, employment, and behavioral health to begin with. And years later, that's still their priority focus because the needs are so great. But what we've got to be able to do as communities is we've got to be able to draw from that large group of coalition members the ability to look at a variety of issues beyond the priorities. That's why a coalition needs to be as big and strong as possible so that we can draw down a good number of them, so at least we've got some forward motion on a wider variety of priorities. And the interaction between physical health, mental health, substance abuse, addiction, etc. is just so clear. So, yes, sir,
You know,
please.
I was looking at that list too, and I guess it's reiterating. I'm Gary Mize from Together Baton Rouge. And I guess it's a comment, and it goes back to the peer support services that was being discussed, and it's kind of related to mental health services. And I am also an ex-con, and I guess and probably, despite my great appearance here with my, probably would have been a moderate risk. And if I had to look at what, if I had to identify the single thing that had saved me, it would be peer support services.
Peer support, good.
So when I look at this list, it's not listed out there. But if I actually wanted to say what saved me, a successful return to citizens. Okay, good. Thank you. I didn't see that.
I should put it in red because
Yeah,
it's that important.
it is absolutely so good. Yeah.
And let me throw
I'm
another
glad that it is listed there because I think that's.
If we were to ask you as a formerly incarcerated person and any other formerly incarcerated people, what works? to reduce return to prison. We created a list. And then I said to Roger, independent of that, give me a list of some of the most important things the research says. And then we put those two lists next to each other, they'd be almost identical. If we listen to the people who've been in prison, we'll know what to do. If we then compare that to the research, it gives us the strength and the discipline to understand that it is actually proven to work. It isn't just we're listening to a bunch of ex-cons. We're not a bunch of hug-and-thuggers, right? And so you've got to have a marriage of both, of the intuitive, experiential input, also with the academic stuff that's going to show us dollars and cents wise why this thing, if we commit to it, is going to work as well as possible. If I had it, what I would like to see is as many representatives on this group, regardless of what role they represent, having been in prison. So that I'm a successful business person representing the business community. Oh, and by the way, from the age of 22 to the age of 35, I was in prison. I'm now 52, and I've been successful. We would like to see more of that. The staff that I have hired with the meager funds that I have include formerly incarcerated people. So it's a really important part of it. And we have to be gut checked. If we go too far into the theoretical, if we're too deep into the system change and it's not balanced against what we're doing with the individuals, then we're going to run amok. And the way that we keep that clear, I think, largely, is through the formerly incarcerated people who are at the table, who can constantly remind us, been there, done that, you're right. Been there, done that, you ain't right. So let's get it fixed. So I'm glad that you raised that point, Roger.
I was going to just address your comments as well. I come to this as a researcher, an evaluator, and I'll put into quotes a scientist, if you will. But the recidivism reduction science and the science around resistance have largely developed and emerged on separate tracks. And it's been somewhat problematic about trying to integrate them and bring them together. I'd love to, at some point, if I have that opportunity, to be able to talk about what the science is on resistance. But in a nutshell, what you brought up is brought out in that science as well, not only from the point of view that the involvement of people who have walked through your shoes, so to speak, is important for developing programs and structures and all of those things. But that science also suggests that an individual like yourself, or that is now returning to the community, is much more receptive to the voices of someone who's walked through their shoes. And to be able to see that there is a pathway forward, that there is hope, because someone who's experienced it like I have, has gone through this and has been successful, that science draws that out as well. It's exactly, I think, what you're commenting on from your own personal experience. And that research base and that science is there, and we need to draw upon that and integrate it into everything we're doing in terms of system reform and planning, and then individual case management planning as well. So I just wanted to say that. I actually might throw in a couple of comments or slides in the presentation I do coming up, which I wasn't going to do, but I think your point is so important about this, not only from getting the insight about planning, but the experience communicated and how that's received by people. All these things are just absolutely critically important. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it is there in the research and the science as well.
And one of the challenges is, how do you balance that experiential with the reality of how tough it is to say to people that are kind of on the lower end of the risk, we're going to give you that much help. We got to reserve our scarce resources. It's a very tough communication to have, but it's got to be done. We absolutely will not reduce the size of the prison population or reduce recidivism across the board, statewide, unless we adhere to this focus on the moderate to the higher risk. This picture is what I described. Our friendly sociopaths, psychopaths in the front are over here, career criminals, right? Our lowest risk folks are over here, very much here, extreme low risk. You wonder, why did you go to prison in the first place? Well, I ran away from the cop when he tried to arrest me, and when he caught me, I hit him. All right, now you're high risk. One incident, that's all it takes. That, bang for the buck. It's this group right here. We've got to figure out. These are the folks the Department of Corrections is going to identify and move into the West Baton Rouge Reentry Center. So we don't have to worry so much about that selection. A couple of points I meant to make in Denton. Now I'm going to open it up for some Q&A and some discussion. One is questions raised about assets in the community. Pastor Jetson, you said at one point, do we, start to look at this stuff and get, deeper into the weeds. One of the earliest deliverables that a steering team should focus on is something called a community assessment. This is an instrument that we've developed. It's a Word document. It's pretty simple. What you do is you use it to assess those assets that you have out there against all of these domains, housing, employment, and the ones that are not the highest priority. You get to understand their funding streams, the number of slots they have, so you can have a good snapshot of what does it look like. This is an antiquated way to do this. This should be web-based. It seems to tie in very nicely with the 211 system, and there might be some opportunities to tie in with that system. We should be thinking about that. But at the end of the day, this community assessment is a early deliverable. As we, y'all as a community, as you move from this training and some of the Wilson grantees are doing some collaborative planning to try to figure out how we're going to move forward as a team, we've got just so many opportunities to be able to work with each other when we're convening folks and letting them know that there's things that we're doing and try to be inclusive as we're doing newsletters and communications and conferences. We want to make sure that everybody is sharing in that communication. It's not unusual for me to go into a large city and have a town hall type meeting and have people on this end of the room from the east side and people on this side of the room from the west side, and them not have any idea that they're actually doing the exact same work, because they're neighborhood based, and in the larger cities, particularly big cities like Detroit, etc., that is evidence. And so sharing and communication is important. There's a lot that I can say, but I won't today, about getting this data set up. You prompted some questions about how do we get the state to let us know who's the roster, who's getting out. One of the Wilson grants is to the Louisiana Public Health Institute. We did publish and what was distributed to some folks locally called pipeline data. That's a snapshot of the numbers and types of people who are in prison from East Baton Rouge. It's the first time that information was published. Has anybody here seen that? The pipeline data? All right, well, what we'll do is we'll once again get that to the community coordinator and then get that to the steering team, and you can have a look at it. We've only done it in 5 parishes, and it's not the most scientific thing we've ever done, but it's pretty good stuff. And it will give you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of numbers, etc. That helps us think through a little bit the nature of this comprehensive planning and how big of a lift it is. In terms of evaluation, we have a couple of federal grants. One is in hand called Smart ReEntry. The Department of Correction has this grant. It includes a requirement for an experimental research design, which means you have a control group and a treatment group. I am no fan of experimental research design. In fact, I don't like them at all, and I don't like to use them unless the model is completely in place. But nonetheless, they're going to have this research done will help them make it as positive as possible. It should be able to let us know how well we're doing against these performance measurements. We have another federal grant that we received. It's a planning grant. Roger and I are both involved in that. It's not with the Department of Corrections, it's the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement. This is a statewide recidivism reduction planning grant. And if we do a good job and compete successfully, we'll be one of 3 states of the 7 who were awarded the planning grants. They award 7 planning grants, and then the 7 compete against each other, which is just too bad. When the federal government's got about a godzillion amount of money to just fund us all, would be my view. But if we get that, we'll be eligible for $1 million in the first year, re-up $1 million the second year, re-up $1 million in the third year. So a total of $3 million over 3 years. And our target is those first 5 parishes, including East Baton Rouge, and then the next 7. But since this is in 2019, this funding, it would be largely for those first 5 parishes. So that, with Justice Reinvestment money, which would be made available in June or July of this year, there is some funding that is coming. It's going to be incumbent. It's going to be incumbent on the local coalitions and their local steering teams to get these committees formed up and functioning so that we're clear by the time we get to July on what are the easy to recognize assets, barriers, and gaps, particularly around education, employment, behavioral health, and housing, so that we can represent what type of funding we need here to be able to address the needs of how many returning high to moderate. We got some idea, but first and foremost, we're going to do it that first 20, and then the second 20. We don't have to be worried about the big picture stuff that'll happen in 2020 and 2021 of larger numbers. But if we can't get it right in 15 or 20, we sure as heck ain't going to get it right for 50 or 100, right? So that's where we're headed. We're going to take a break in a minute, and Roger's going to get ready for his presentation that's going to start at, what time do we have now?
5 to 10 right now.
So let's take about 10 minutes before we break for 15 minutes.